So here's a beautiful part, very sunny today, right at the feet of that magnificent Cadena. The locals call it the mountain where the witches live, and they fly from one rock to another across this valley. I'll show it to you in a minute. See, that's Castilla d'Alaro, another rock, we call it Shiva rock. So the witch is apparently flying. Okay, let's keep walking. Let's keep walking. Maybe we can find a suitable spot where we can sit down and do a bit of the recording. So what is reliable these days? What is there left to hold on to? Was there ever something to hold on to? And all this is just an excuse to consider this, what we are currently going through, as a calamity that we suddenly begin to abandon well-established and well-held positions. With the number of online support, so to speak, that is being offered now, perhaps we can include ourselves there in that. The number of self-help coaches multiply by a dozen almost every week, and there are no shortage of perspectives and methodologies. Everything is supplied now by a bucket on how to deal with the situation, how to get on top of it and have a grip with reality. So in this, I would like to speak to what it means to being aware, holding on to consciousness, or simply remaining conscious versus resting on spiritual insight. Because something should be said about this perspective, which now really getting the momentum, and we touched upon it in our last talk in this very spot, just on another boulder over there, how alternative views of information, reality, is now being out there more than ever, almost into our face, juxtaposed against the obviously what could be considered as an official line. And I'm not going to go back to the same topic we dealt with last week, but rather I would invite all of you is to look into the connection between individuals, individual consciousness, and collective consciousness, and how this is reflected in turn into this whole affair of the governing principle, the government, institutions, organizations that are here literally as an expression of that collective consciousness. Because there is still very strong perspective which a lot of people seem to resonate and find solace in, as it is in terms of the possibility that things can be adjusted as long as we just expose the nasty side and expose those who are joined to take advantage of this being in the position of power. And I'm not going again, as I said, back to the conspiracy theories, and some people found it to be offensive somehow. Conspiracy theories were not born yesterday, they were not born in 20th century. Conspiracy theories existed in ancient Egypt, in ancient China. Definitely they have existed 100 and 200 years ago, and have been accompanying always what would be known as an official line. So there's nothing new about it. What rather still pretty much left unexamined by a majority of us, because those who have delved into it at some point and perhaps have some insights into the direct nature of reality, of how it all sits together, this area is no longer hold, if you will, unknown territory. But where does the individual consciousness, where do I sit in relation to something which has formed and became that body of government? Is it in any way independent from my own awareness, from my own consciousness, from my own being here, or is it interdependent one way or the other, and somehow the state of affairs here influence that what comes into the governing body, then imposing its will on the nation, on people, on the state, and resulting in a well-being of each and every individual, or adding to its misery. This is what we need to examine very attentively. And here, this is just an introduction, because it's a very big topic and one would need to return to it on more than one occasion. That is how individual consciousness and collective consciousness are interdependent reality, one influencing the other and being influenced in turn. So therefore, the possibility that there could be some kind of good or bad government, good or bad group of people who simply rise to the power one way or the other, independently from the state of affairs of the level of consciousness of its tribe or a nation, is simply impossibility if we are to speak about it from this perspective, from the perspective of consciousness, from the perspective that everything is indeed interdependent. Everything is a reflection of everything else. And therefore every unit here is not an independently existing unit. You and I are not independently existing units, but part and parcel of that holographic reality, where every minute change in your and my consciousness impacts the whole. Impacts the whole to a degree where that whole can crystallize into any structure, any structure. So in other words, to borrow simple examples from history, whenever a nation ends up with a dictator, it is because the status or the state of consciousness of that nation has been reduced, fell down to the level of such victimhood that a dictatorship is a result. The dictatorship becomes the manifestation of the collective heartbeats that expresses itself in a totalitarian regime. Likewise, when a nation or a state, a country, suddenly begins to enjoy an extraordinary governing body, an extraordinary intelligent, outstanding leader, that always heralds the fact that something is happening within the collective state of affairs of the global psyche of that group of people which calls itself a country, a nation. And we also can borrow many examples, such examples from history, far and more close one, when the shift in collective consciousness would bring about individuals who then express the very will of the sum total of these individuals. I'm not going to mention any specific names. All of you can relate to that in your own way by drawing freely from the examples of your own history, history of your own country, or history of the world as you know it. So in other words, this is a continuation of that, if you will, perspective expounded upon last week, where we have tried to expose this perspective which keep us prisoners of circumstances, or simply reinforcing this certain status that we have got accustomed to and somehow feel that this is the best way out, is to simply blame a certain group of people, a blame for the lack of transparency, blame for concentration of power for very, very mean end, so as to usurp the freedom of the majority of individuals. We are picking it up where we left it and building upon this understanding now with regard to whether it is at all possible to have something like that to happen, whether it's at all possible to have some kind of reorganization of the external structure without the need for any internal changes, without the need of consciousness undergoing transformation here and now within yourself, within myself. This is a timely affair. Never perhaps have been a more important time than now to ponder on this, simply because we stand on the verge of that shift, where the collective shift in consciousness is brought about by a radical shift in perspective of many of its individuals on the account of these individuals no longer being prisoners of the contracted consciousness and have undergone a certain degree of expansion. If that is the case, then one should not worry at all. One should sleep well, and one should have a sound rest, being rest assured that as long as some fundamental changes are taking place here within myself, these changes will bound to be brought about in a society. How they will happen, who will bring them about, who will initiate that process is beside the point. We've spoken about it on many occasions in some of our live and public gatherings, at the conferences as well as at the retreats, speaking precisely to the job and the role of a spiritually minded individual, spiritually minded being, who understands that his or her individuality is no longer an isolated event in space-time. It's no longer an isolated event in the universe. In fact, it's a universe expressing itself in its totality in this very individual. Therefore, if consciousness is contracted and experiencing itself only to the capacity of what is available in that contracted state, then it will be almost inconsistent to ask for that individual to enjoy any real freedom. And that freedom is independent from that, what we call our circumstances. Whether one is born in a privileged setting, into a family, into a heritage, where one can simply inherit the status quo, where one is born in a so-called developed country, when there is no starvation, no immediate state of war, and everything is nice and dandy until something like this quarantine dawns, and suddenly one begins to smell the coffee and begin to analyze one's situation from a very different perspective. So, with this, I want to also throw in something that has been mentioned by me very briefly at the very beginning, and that is what is reliable right now. What can we really have as a solid ground of our understanding, of our thinking, of obviously of our feelings, and as a result of our actions. Where can we anchor ourselves so as not to be subjected to this calamity of the current state of unpredictable weather in the bay where we docked our ship? What is that anchor? Can it hit the bottom? Can it rest somewhere so as to give us that reassurance? And with all the information, and of course with all the paraphernalia and with all the solutions available out there, multiplying by a day, as we can kind of slightly metaphorically allow ourselves to put, what is the spiritual aspirant here can use as a valid, if you will, asset? How can one maintain being conscious, or one is subjected to these experiences that one perhaps had a year or two ago, or 10 years ago, or not so long ago in a special setting, at a setting of a retreat, maybe at a setting of an immersion, whilst going through some undoubtful experiences heralding some certain opening, shifts in perception. What can be used? What can be safely relied upon? Well, it's in the human nature, it's in the nature of the individual to grasp something. It's very much in the nature of that, what we consider to be that horizontal plane of reality, when we are almost pre-programmed to have that grip, so that to end up with something, so as to end up with this tangible sense of I got it, I have something. And then it results in this psychological attitude of achieving something versus not getting something done. You know, this I have achieved, yeah, this is yet I have to achieve. And all this dialogue goes on in the mind, robbing us of a sense of peace, robbing us of a sense of being present fully to what this really magnificent reality of being embodied at any time really presents. What is reliable here? How can one remain conscious? Is it the same principle of holding something, holding on to something? Well, if we truly want to hear the spiritual perspective, or rather perspective of the spirit, so as to give ourselves this exposure to how things are as opposed to how we prefer them to be. When it comes to the perspective of your own consciousness, here, being conscious, it doesn't know lack of anything. It's by very virtue already full of everything. It's fullness itself, expressed as fullness and manifesting as fullness. And up until that becomes one's second nature, when one knows that in all circumstances, that certain hankering for, that certain lack of something will continue presenting itself, maybe as a leitmotif or raison d'etre for overcoming that eventually. So we're not here set to criticize this or belittling this hankering and this whole mode of achieving something which we haven't yet achieved and bringing about these qualitative changes in our circumstances so that as to give us a greater sense of a well-being on the account of this being done, this being achieved, and yet that meant to be achieved. But understanding at least that consciousness is never diminished. Consciousness is never, for an iota, is less. It may be experienced here locally as a lack of this, as a lack of that, lack of resources, lack of happiness, lack of quietude, lack of pure joy, whatever that might be, from the field of material possessions to the field which is impossible to define in terms of the language. But one way or the other, it is impossible to hold on to consciousness because there's nothing to hold on to. One can only be conscious to the capacity of how much consciousness is available to this experience. In other words, it's all down to how much the windows of perception are cleansed, how much the perceptual capacity is there, available at a given moment in time, which makes this experience fully illumined so as to fall back onto itself in that self-referral state where one is simply aware of one's own reality as this experience, or if you want, through this experience. In Tantra, this understood very well, and in Kashmir Shaivism, it's beautifully, profoundly illustrated in the example of how awareness expresses itself in the form of self-awareness. It's Shiva as Shakti, performing on the stage for its own sake of entertainment. And soon as that experience passed, one walks off the stage and falls back into that state of self-awareness. It is precisely what happens at every level of experience, absolutely all of them. There is this experience which has duration, which has this trajectory, and falling back onto nothing other than the self. So it is this that needs to be known, that in all circumstances, in all experiences, this is intact at the ground level of, let's say, one's whole life, if one's life can be spoken of as experience, gaining, or at the infinitesimally minute level of something as just passing breeze that brought this scent of this yet unknown flower, and there it's gone. In all these experiences, there is this rise, peak, subjugation, when it's subdued and falling back onto itself. So one cannot hold to being more conscious. It is simply available on its own accord because it belongs to no one other than consciousness itself. So this is the key, the hint, the opening. As for spiritual experiences, insight and insights and so forth, whether one can rely on them, it's like memory. You see, it's like memory. One can give variety of examples how this has the value and how that value is limited. Yes, there is value in anything that we experience. We even have that commonly used term, wisdom, born of experience. So in other words, wisdom here is not something that is granted, given. Wisdom is a result of perhaps repeated experience, errors, falling on one's face, falling on one's butt, is all goes into this, what we then call acquiring some wisdom on the account of having enough of this or that experience. But when it comes to spiritual insights, when it comes to this ultimate state of affairs of who we are and what to lean on, it's like, if you will, a memory of yesterday's supper may be a nice idea in a tummy, but it will evaporate with every hour of getting more and more hungry. So think about that. This is as far as all spiritual insights one has gained. These spiritual insights need to be converted, if you will, become fabric of one's own awareness to such degree, then it's not on the account of being reminded or reminding oneself of what one has had experienced, the breakthroughs one had, understandings, but rather simply falling at any time onto that what simply is, what is by definition is undefinable, by definition is ephemeral and beautiful because of that, because one cannot put one's finger on it, because it's mysterious, because it's glorious, because it's one's own nature. It can never be taken away because it was never given. This is the way to contemplate on the nature of consciousness in terms of whether one can remain conscious. And of course, just to add, it has little to do with being mindful. Being mindful is a methodology. It's a tiptoeing. Trying to be aware of something, it's an exercise, a tiptoeing. A needed exercise, very often required one, but not something that can supplement what one's natural state is all about.